Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma. Upadhyay. Let's get started.
Where we started, Russia could at any point launch an attack in Ukraine.
Рад вас видеть всех, уважаемые коллеги. Нужно наращивать тренировки.
Is Europe heading for war? It's the closest it has been to war in 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's what a top diplomat in the EU has said. The theatre of conflict is Ukraine. Russia is pulling out its citizens and possibly diplomats from Ukraine and has also lined up troops along the border. The US has sent its Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to Kiev. The UK is sending weapons. Canada is sending a special forces contingent. NATO allies are pitching in. Russia says they are the ones escalating the tensions. Ukraine says it may be invaded at any moment. Now, all of this sounds extremely serious, and it has been like this, more or less, for over a month now. It is clear that nobody wants war. It is also clear that nobody wants to backtrack first. Multiple rounds of talks have failed, so I come back to the question I began with. Is Europe heading for war? On Gravitas tonight, we'll bring you all the updates and the analysis. Also on the show, is Xi Jinping in hiding because of the Wuhan virus? Pakistan's foreign minister says he doesn't go anywhere, doesn't meet anyone because of the virus. Lankan MPs have written to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi seeking his intervention to implement a contentious amendment in the Sri Lankan parliament. A special report coming up. Is your child a victim of virtual world addiction? Experts say the pandemic has hit children. All the screen time has made them rash and anxious. And are noisy toilets a human rights violation? Italian courts think so. We'll tell you why this is trivializing a very serious matter. We begin as always with Gravitas Global Headlines.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson faces the heat in Parliament amid outrage over multiple lockdown parties at 10 Downing. The opposition deems Johnson incapable of leading the nation amid a crisis.
If a Prime Minister misleads Parliament, should they resign?
This as consumer price inflation in the UK surges to the highest level in 3 decades, putting pressure on households that are already facing a spike in energy prices. The acting Afghanistan Prime Minister calls on international governments to officially recognize the nation's Taliban government. Mullah Hassan Akhund says in a news conference in Kabul that all conditions had been met. He appealed to Islamic countries in particular to recognize the Taliban. In a relief for aviation firms in the US, telecom giants AT&T and Verizon Communications have agreed to temporarily suspend some 5G wireless towers near key airports. The airlines want 5G to be banned within 2 miles of airport runways over concerns of flight disruptions. In a push to maintain its strict COVID-0 strategy, Hong Kong orders the mass culling of hamsters after 11 of the rodents tested positive for COVID-19. Animal rights activists sound an alarm as Hong Kong authorities say they will kill around 2,000 small animals. Israeli forces destroy the home of a Palestinian family in the Flashpoint Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem. This comes days after the family tried to avoid the demolition by threatening to blow up the house. Indian fugitive business tycoon Vijay Mallya and his family are set to be evicted from their luxurious London home. After the mortgage, Swiss bank UBS won the right in court to repossess and sell the multi-million-pound home. At least 10 people have been killed in flash floods triggered by torrential rains in Madagascar's capital. Reports suggest around 500 people have been rendered homeless. Authorities warn of more heavy rainfall in the coming days. 2021 joins the list of the 7 warmest years on record. The UN Weather Agency says that last year's temperatures remained high despite the cooling effect of the La Niña weather phenomenon. Defending champion Naomi Osaka and world number 1 Ashley Barty have stormed into the 3rd round of the Australian Open. Osaka overcame a slight wobble in the 2nd set against Madison Brengle to win 6-love, 6-4, while home favorite Barty needed less than an hour to get past the Italian qualifier Lucia Bronzetti. Men's heavyweights Rafael Nadal and Alexander Zverev have booked their place in the last 32 of the Australian Open with convincing wins. 20-time Grand Slam champion Nadal beat Germany's Yannick Hanfmann 6-2, 6-3, 6-4, while world number 4 and Olympic champion Zverev made short work of Australian John Millman.
Is Europe heading for war? It's a question that's been asked almost every day for the last 1 month, and I'll tell you why. Because tension has been escalating almost every day. Ukraine says it fears an invasion at any moment. The US says the situation is dangerous. Russia says it's NATO's fault. Europe says it's the closest to war it has been in 3 decades. We'll start with the Russia-Ukraine border. This is what it looks like. These are Russian soldiers stationed near the Ukraine border and conducting tactical exercises complete with gunfire and missiles. In response, Ukraine has deployed anti-tank missiles, weapons they got from their Western friends very recently. Ukraine showed them off in a Hollywood-style video. So with soldiers deployed and saber-rattling in full form, is war only a matter of time? Diplomatic efforts are on, but all sides are talking at each other rather than talking to each other. The crisis began in October last year. 2 months, 2 weeks and 6 days have passed, no breakthrough. Let me show you some satellite pictures now. These are Russian soldiers near the Ukrainian border. Moscow has been moving tanks, infantry vehicles, rocket launchers and other military equipment. Some eyewitnesses managed to click photographs. This is the Russian military equipment that we're talking about being transported on rail cars. Eyewitnesses have spotted several such trains passing through. Russia is building pressure. It began by deploying troops in the north and the east, the areas where it shares a border with Ukraine. And now it has sent troops to Belarus. From here, Russia could potentially target Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Russian military hardware has begun arriving in Belarus. This welcome ceremony happened at an undisclosed location. Russia and Belarus say they'll now conduct joint military drills to practice what they call repelling external attacks.
Presidents of the Russian Federation and the Republic of Belarus agreed to hold these joint drills last December. The presidents decided to conduct a surprise check of forces and appraise their readiness to provide military security and also to exercise joint action in various situations for threat repelling and stability operations at the Union state borders.
The US has pressed the panic button. It feels this deployment in Belarus is a major escalation. America believes Russian troops could stay in Belarus permanently and with nuclear weapons. The Russian deployment coincides with an upcoming referendum, one that could turn Belarus into a garrison for Russia. The US is concerned about the proposed changes to the Belarusian constitution. The new law could allow Russia to host conventional and nuclear forces in Belarus. At this point, this is only an American assessment. There's little to suggest that Russia and Belarus are acting on this. So what's the basis of America's assertions? A threat by Alexander Lukashenko last year. He's the leader of Belarus. Last year, Lukashenko said his country will host Russian nukes if NATO forces moved similar weapons to eastern Ukraine. Speaking of which, US intelligence is also concerned about what's happening in Ukraine, what Russia is doing in Ukraine. It says Russia has deployed operatives inside Ukraine in the rebel-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine. The US believes these operatives could carry out acts of sabotage, something that looks like a military operation that could be blamed later on Ukraine. US intelligence says this would give Vladimir Putin a pretext to launch an invasion. Moscow, of course, has dismissed all of these claims and has called them misinformation. But the Biden administration is acting on these inputs. It is giving more weapons to Ukraine, mortars, anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, among others. NATO allies are expected to send these, starting with the UK, which has already shared some weapons. The White House says Russia could launch an invasion any time.
So let's be clear. Our view is this is an extremely dangerous situation. We're now at a stage where Russia could at any point launch an attack in Ukraine.
An extremely dangerous situation, she says. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken landed in Kiev today. He met Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Today, there are some 100,000 Russian soldiers near Ukraine's borders, and in that sense, the threat to Ukraine is unprecedented. So the President asked me to underscore once again our commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity, to its sovereignty, to its independence. And I know that's a message that you've heard not just from us, but from so many partners throughout Europe.
What about America's ally Europe? Well, they too are worried about the escalating tensions. The European Union feels the region is spiraling towards its worst security crisis in decades. Germany says it cannot afford to stay silent anymore.
Still too early to tell whether they will help de-escalate the situation Russia created by concentrating 100,000 troops along the border with Ukraine. But after years of rising tensions, staying silent is not a sensible option.
Now, this is the version of America and its allies. They are blaming Russia for what's happening. Now let's tell you what Russia says. It claims the West is escalating tensions. The West is at fault. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has issued a firm response. He's accused the United States and NATO of double standards.
Мы никому ничем не угрожаем.
We don't threaten anybody with anything, but we do hear the threats addressed to us. I hope it only reflects certain emotions that certain powers incite within the Western camp. We will act in accordance with concrete steps, concrete actions.
Конкретными шагами, конкретными делами.
So this is a classic stalemate. Multiple rounds of talks have failed. Thousands of troops on both sides are staring down at each other. Any misstep now could result in a full-blown conflict. And even the smallest mistake could prove to be very costly. Ukraine basically is a board game right now. The players are foreign, the rules are imported, but all the pieces are Ukrainian. It's a classic Cold War tussle. Russia and America will not fight directly. Instead, they're facing off through Ukraine. It's what you call a proxy war. The world also sees this as a board game. X number of troops, Y number of tanks, rocket launchers, all of it controlled by big powers, the United States and Russia. Beneath this build-up is an even bigger battle, the battle of narrative. I'll give you one example. Here's what the American media is reporting today. Russia has almost completed build-up of forces. Moscow could launch an invasion at any moment. If you read this, what picture do you get? That Ukraine could be attacked at any moment. Now let's look at the Russian media. Here's what they are reporting. Russian embassy calls on US to abandon plans to provide more weapons to Ukraine. So America is arming Ukraine and Russia, the friendly neighbor, is worried. This is the battle of narrative I was talking about. If you ask Washington, Russia is the unreasonable bully. If you ask Moscow, America is the outsider encroaching on their gated community. The truth is somewhere in between. But as they say, the first casualty of war is truth. Which brings me to the most important question. Will there be war? And if yes, who wants a war? Well, here's the common sense argument. Nobody wants war. Not Vladimir Putin, not Joe Biden. But what is the military buildup all about? It's about projecting power. It's about imposing an aggressive foreign policy. You see, war as a strategy is pointless. We're talking about hundreds of lives lost, millions of dollars spent. It's not a pragmatic strategy. But war as a bargaining chip can be useful. And that's what Putin is doing right now. He's fiercely protecting his sphere of influence, not by going to war, but by threatening war. And Joe Biden has two options here. A, order NATO to pull back, basically return to the Cold War lines, abandon Eastern Europe. Or B, stand firm. Biden can either offer talks or threaten sanctions. Right now, he's doing a bit of both. But where is the middle ground? Why is the default foreign policy setting aggressive? Because it's easier to sell. Putin is seeing the popular revolts around him, first in Ukraine, then in Belarus, and then Kazakhstan. How can he prevent that in Russia? He cannot brag about the economy. So the best bet is security. Putin's propaganda is straightforward. The West is the monster and he is the Russian savior. What about Joe Biden? Well, he too wants an aggressive foreign policy. Tomorrow marks 1 year in office for Joe Biden as president. What are his foreign policy highlights so far? A debacle in Afghanistan, a stalemate with Iran, and a rejection from North Korea. Biden's popularity ratings are already heading for rock bottom. One more loss could seal his fate. So like I said at the start, the players are foreign, the rules are imported, but the pieces are Ukrainian. And like all board games, the pieces don't get a say. Right now, the US and Russia are holding talks in Geneva. Nobody expects a breakthrough, but talks are happening nonetheless. Just one problem. Ukraine is not at the talking table. America and Russia are discussing Ukraine's future, but Ukraine is not part of those talks. And this is precisely the problem with this conflict. It is not Ukraine's fight. It's America and Russia's fight. NATO is adamant that they will keep pushing eastward. Russia is adamant that Eastern Europe is theirs. Has anyone bothered to ask Ukraine? Well, their ambition is clear. Ukraine wants to join the Western Alliance, but the question is why? Is this ideology or insurance? Until 2014, Ukraine was happy being non-aligned. That's when Russia invaded and captured Crimea. That invasion changed the equation. Now Ukraine wants to protect its territory, and their best bet is joining the NATO. So there is no elaborate ideological excuse here. This is pure strategy, and Ukraine has the right to select this strategy. Unfortunately, foreign complications have entered the fray. Two world leaders eager to impress their people, one alliance eager to become relevant again, and stuck in the middle is Ukraine. So to answer my first question, nobody genuinely wants a war. But that's not an excuse to keep the spectacle going. In March 2020, when the Wuhan virus was declared a pandemic, China closed its borders for nearly all outsiders. 2 years on, the travel restrictions have been eased to some extent, but only select travelers from 23 countries are being allowed in China. And surprisingly, China's iron brother Pakistan is not on that list. Since January last year, Pakistan has been under a temporary travel ban, which basically means Pakistani citizens cannot travel to China without a special permission from the Chinese embassy. The ban has been particularly harsh on Pakistani students enrolled in Chinese universities. There are at least 28,000 of them. For over 2 years, they've been stuck in Pakistan, compelled to take virtual classes, waiting for Beijing to green light their return. One such student, frustrated with a 2-year-long ordeal, decided to confront the foreign minister of Pakistan, the one and only Shah Mahmood Qureshi. The student told the foreign minister that students from Malaysia are being allowed to return to China. Why not students from Pakistan? Why is Islamabad not building pressure on Beijing? You have to watch what Qureshi told him.
मलेशिया और बात है, चाइना की बात हो रही है। चाइना किसी को अलाउ नहीं करता। हम लॉजिक नहीं है ना, वायरस का जो एक है वो वैक्सीनेशन है, क्वारंटीन है, पाकिस्तान में भी। यार मुझे क्या समझा रहे हो? मुझे नहीं पता, मुझे नहीं पता। कोशिश कर चीन की पॉलिसी है, वो नहीं करना चाह रहे। उनका प्रेसिडेंट शी कहीं निकलता ही नहीं है, मिलता ही नहीं किसी को। हमारी मीटिंग उसे रखी है, उन्होंने कहा कोई होगा, पहले टेस्ट होगा, ये होगा, एक बंदा निकले खाते में तो आपके बच्चे मार दो। तो यार मेरा कसूर नहीं है ना, तो ना हम तुम लेकर आए। बेटा हम तो कोशिश कर रहे हैं और करेंगे, जो हमारे बस में है हम करेंगे। सर कोई और अल्टरनेटिव भी हमें नहीं मिल सकता। मैं तो ऑल्टरनेटिव है ही नहीं, ऑल्टरनेटिव यही है। बेटा मुझे पता है जो हम कर सकते हैं, बेटा हम करेंगे, हम करेंगे। हमारा कोई हम क्यों चाहेंगे कि आपकी तालीम खराब हो? हमें क्या हासिल होगा? बेटा तुम्हारा ख्याल नहीं करते, तुम्हारा ख्याल नहीं करते। पूरा सिटी बंद कर यार 2 साल अगर कोरोना बढ़ेगा 2 साल और हो सकते हैं।
You heard him. This is not our fault, he says. Even Xi Jinping does not go anywhere. To be honest, what Shah Mahmood Qureshi said is nothing wrong. Xi Jinping literally does not go anywhere these days. He hasn't left China for over 2 years now. 732 days to be precise. Blame the pandemic, blame domestic troubles, global disapproval, or simply the fear of being confronted. Whatever be the case, Xi Jinping is in hiding, and China has not been able to hide this fact. But now you have the foreign minister of Pakistan mocking the Chinese president on tape. It's embarrassing for China. It's dangerous for Pakistan. Xi Jinping does not like being mocked. Ask Winnie the Pooh. He's banned in China because the president does not like jokes. So we'd advise caution to Mr. Qureshi the next time he visits China. As for these Pakistani students, the foreign minister's statement has only fueled their anger. They're venting online. A hashtag is trending on Pakistani Twitter. It says, "Take back Pak students to China." Why are they so desperate to return? You see, a lot of them were studying in China on fully funded scholarships. Some of them were also receiving a monthly stipend of around 70,000 Pakistani rupees. But ever since China locked its borders, the scholarships have been withheld and the stipends halted. Students who wish to continue courses online are being asked to pay for classes. Not everyone can afford these, hence the outrage. I'll show you some posts. The first one says, "It's so sad that we are stuck at home for 20 months. China still doesn't care about our distress. We have no stipend, no money, no job." Here's another one which reads, "Tourism okay, business visas okay, work visas okay, students, no, it's a very dangerous virus." Yet another student shared this, "We are vaccinated, ready for quarantine, now what's your excuse?" Attached is an image of a child drowning. As another child with a business visa gets embraced. And some students are directly lashing out at China. Sample this tweet. It says, "Dear China, please don't destroy our future." Now, we sympathize with their plight. China is allowing students from Malaysia, Thailand and South Korea to return, but not students from Pakistan. You would have thought China and Pakistan are thick as thieves. Well, think again. For the moment, we'll turn to Sri Lanka, where Tamil lawmakers have written a letter to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi seeking his help. They want him to intervene on behalf of them. Quick background. Sri Lankan Tamils, also known as Ilam Tamils, are descendants of indentured workers from India. During the British rule, they were taken to Sri Lanka from the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. Today, they constitute a majority in Sri Lanka's northern province, but they're still perceived as outsiders by a lot of people. They find themselves at the lowest rung in the social hierarchy. In 1987, India signed an accord with the Sri Lankan government to change things. The accord created several provisions for their upliftment. But 35 years on, those provisions have barely been implemented. The return of the Rajapaksas to power has complicated things further. The current president of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was once accused of war crimes against Sri Lankan Tamils. And this has fueled fears among the community that their rights might erode further under his rule. Here's a report.
New Delhi has received a letter. It's addressed to the Prime Minister of India. It comes with a request from Tamil lawmakers in Sri Lanka. They want the Indian Prime Minister to intervene to ensure a lasting solution to a long-standing issue: the implementation of the contentious 13th Amendment. What's that? An amendment to Sri Lanka's constitution. It was passed in 1987 under the India-Lanka Accord, inked by former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and then Sri Lankan President J.R. Jayawardene. The amendment made Sinhala and Tamil the official languages of Sri Lanka. It also called for the creation of provincial councils for Tamils living in Sri Lanka. The idea was to ensure the rights of Sri Lankan Tamils in every sphere of life. But these provisions have barely been implemented. Successive Sri Lankan governments have dragged their feet on the issue. They've called the amendment unfair and partisan to the majority Sinhalese people. They say devolution of powers to the Tamil community is tantamount to federalism. It will lead to calls of independence by Sri Lankan Tamils. So for 3 decades, this amendment has been on the back burner. Tamil MPs want to change that. A delegation of MPs from the Tamil National Alliance, led by their leader, R. Sampanathan, met the Indian High Commissioner in Colombo and handed over a letter about their concerns. Addressed to the Indian Prime Minister, the letter reads, "We urge Prime Minister Modi to ensure Tamil-speaking people live with dignity, self-respect, peace and security in the areas of their natural habitation, exercising the right to self-determination within the framework of a united, undivided country." The letter goes on to recall numerous public commitments made by leaders on both sides to implement the amendment. It says Lankan Tamils are thankful for India's constant pursuit for their rights, including Prime Minister Modi's address to the Sri Lankan Parliament, where he stressed on his firm belief in cooperative federalism. He made these remarks in 2015. 6 years on, the return of Rajapaksas to power has brought the spotlight back on this concept. The Rajapaksa government has embarked on a series of constitutional changes, and given the accusations of war crimes on Lankan Tamils by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the Tamil community fears he might just repeal the 13th Amendment. Forget implementing it. Bureau Report, WION. World is One.
There are 2 sides to every coin. The virtual world is no different. When the Wuhan virus pandemic struck, virtual learning came to the rescue of our children. It helped them continue classes from the safety of their homes. Soon their piano lessons also became virtual. So did the karate classes. Since our children could not meet their friends in person, they began meeting virtually, playing board games virtually. And before we knew it, children began spending more time virtually than ever before. Today, an average child's day begins with virtual classes. In some cases, it is followed by virtual coaching classes, virtual book club meetings, virtual gaming, virtually chatting with friends. You get my point. Today in India, children are spending up to 5 hours online every day. In the US, children aged 8 to 12 are spending 4.5 hours online. Teens are spending 6.5 hours online. How much time should they be spending, ideally, online? Not more than 2 hours. That's what the WHO or the World Health Organization says, which means our children everywhere in the world have been exceeding this limit twice over, and the impact of this is beginning to show. Today, our children have become so comfortable in the virtual world that the real world seems alien to them. Some children have begun displaying behavioral issues. Parents say they start crying or screaming when their phones are taken away from them. Some children get violent and start throwing things. And we're talking about kids as young as 5. Experts call it the virtual world addiction. It is making children impulsive and rash, hampering their overall growth, also taking a toll on their language skills and interpersonal skills. For over 2 years, our children have been living in a virtual world full time. To the tiny tots, it has become their real world. Ideally, they should have been boarding the vehicle to play school every morning or to school every morning. They should have been spending time with their classmates and teachers, making new friends, spending time with them in playgrounds, sharing lunch with them, visiting zoos with them. Instead, children are trapped behind the screen. They are visiting zoos and learning about different animals, but that is happening virtually. They're playing hide and seek, but their hiding space is limited to the camera frame. You know, none of this is normal. The pandemic has interfered with a child's normal learning curve. No wonder they're acting up. Around preschool is when a child picks her favorite soft toy or toy car and holds on to it even when she's eating, even when she's being put to sleep. But in this age of the Wuhan virus, laptops, tablets and phones have become that toy car. I know all of this sounds a bit dystopian. Experts say prolonged screen time also causes a sense of isolation in children. As they grow up, that feeling of isolation turns into anxiety and in some cases depression. No parent would want this for their children. But we also wouldn't want them to drop out of virtual learning or miss out on virtual activities. It's a catch-22 for every parent out there. So what can you do? How can you keep your child safe in this virtual age? perhaps look for a more advanced approach to learning, a hybrid form of learning with a mix of online and offline activities. This will reduce a child's exposure to the virtual world while also ensuring her overall development. Schedule a lot of non-screen activities, perhaps. Turn off screens during meals. Those baby shark videos during lunch are not a great idea. And above all, you can set a good example. Put down your phones, tablets and laptops around your children so that they learn that being free of these devices is what is normal. Talking about serious problems, another controversy has hit the Beijing Winter Games, the Winter Olympics. Almost 3,000 athletes are participating in the event. A group of activists is giving them some advice. They say the players, Olympians, who end up in China, should refrain from criticizing China while they're in Beijing, because the International Olympic Committee might not be able to protect them. Our next report tells you how the IOC is compromising on human rights of the Olympians.
The International Olympic Committee to announce the host city, Beijing.
The Winter Olympics begin in less than 3 weeks. Close to 3,000 athletes will participate in the Games. Human rights activists have some advice for them. When you are in Beijing, stay silent on human rights. Rights groups and player advocacy groups are concerned. They fear Beijing's wrath if an athlete chooses to raise China's human rights violations. Activists say Olympians won't have any protections once they land in China. The reason is the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC.
One of the reasons we came out with a statement last week or earlier this week advising athletes not to speak up, which is absolutely ridiculous that we're telling athletes to be quiet and to leave and to get home. And the reason being is Rule 50.
Rob Kula is referring to Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter. It bans all kinds of protests during the event, whether it's at any venue, on the podium, or anywhere else. No athlete can hold any kind of protest during the event. The language is perfect to justify a crackdown by Chinese authorities. And that's what rights groups like Human Rights Watch fear. They don't know if Beijing will go after any athlete for speaking out. But considering recent events, they think Olympians shouldn't take any chances.
Well, we don't know yet. However, look at the Peng Shuai case. She made one post on the Chinese social media alleging sexual assault against a retired high-level Chinese official. Look at what happened. She has been, her voice has been entirely wiped off the Chinese internet. Anybody who discusses her cases are, removed from the internet.
The Peng Shuai case only exposed how weak the IOC is on human rights. The tennis star was silenced after she spoke out about sexual assault. Tennis stars and officials questioned Beijing for silencing Peng Shuai. But the IOC amplified Chinese propaganda. Women's Tennis Association had doubts about Peng's safety. Beijing allowed only the IOC to speak to her. The statements from the Olympic body failed to mention the assault. Instead, the IOC said Peng was doing fine and relaxed. In light of this, former Olympians are demanding blanket protection for athletes.
Athletes don't only enjoy human rights when they're not competing. Athletes don't only enjoy human rights when they're not on the podium. They enjoy human rights at all times. And so, yes, athletes should be protected when they're not on the podium and not on the field of play, but they should be protected when they're in those places as well.
The IOC's record does not inspire confidence. In 2020, Iran executed champion wrestler Navid Afkari. He was accused of murdering a security guard, but Afkari said he had been tortured into making a confession. All the IOC could do was to express shock at the execution. The Olympic body received similar criticism over Belarus too. Activists believe the IOC could have done more to protect Belarusian athletes from an authoritarian regime. In China's case, the IOC has gone into total submission. Ahead of the Winter Games, it remains mum on China's persecution of Uyghurs. Some groups claim The official merchandise for the Winter Games was made by forced Uyghur labor. Olympic officials remain reluctant to launch an investigation. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Now let's talk about a crisis that's facing everyone on this planet, the climate crisis. We've been telling you how global warming is killing our planet. Our forests are burning, our towns are flooding, the marine animals are being boiled alive. But to most of us, none of this seems to matter because as long as global warming is not affecting us directly, it remains a non-issue or a distant issue. We talk about global warming at forums and conferences. We write about it on Twitter. But we do very little to tackle it ourselves. Will this change if I told you that global warming is affecting our newborns, that global warming is affecting the health of fetuses? Look at what a new study has found. Global warming has links to premature birth. Scientists studied 200,000 births between 2007 and 2011. A quarter of these mothers were exposed to at least one very hot day while being pregnant. The risk of premature birth increased 15%. Another study has found that a mother's exposure to wildfires before conception can double the risk of birth defects. What causes wildfires? Global warming. So the only way to tackle the problem, and many other problems, is by stopping global warming. How do we do that? We all know that. By making changes to our day-to-day lives, by opting for public transport, reducing carbon emissions, switching to cleaner fuels, reducing deforestation, you know the drill. The idea is to edit our current lifestyle in order to reduce global warming. But there are some who believe that we could edit the composition of the atmosphere instead, reducing global warming by dimming the sun's rays and cooling the planet's surface. Can this be done? Yes, it can. Sometimes the sun's rays are dimmed naturally or because of a natural calamity. What happened in 1991 makes for a good example here. The Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines. It sent up an umbrella-like cloud of rock, ash and smoke. The planet-cooling aerosols lingered in the air and they lowered the Earth's surface temperature for at least a year. The effect lasted for over a year, in fact. But trying to achieve this artificially can be disastrous. First things first, can it be done? Can we humans dim the sun's rays? Theoretically speaking, yes, we can. To dim the amount of sunlight that falls on Earth, we would need to inject reflective particles into the atmosphere. Not one or two, but in large quantities. It is called solar radiation modification, or SRM. It's something that's been hotly debated as a climate policy option. But should this policy option even be considered? That is the question. Experts say it's a big no. Because one, dimming the sun's rays could disrupt monsoons in South Asia and Western Africa, which means dimming the sun's rays could damage our rain-fed crops. It could hit food security, deprive millions of food, and force more people to go to bed hungry. Point number two, dimming the sun's rays could also dry the Amazon. So 60 experts and scientists have written a letter. This is what they say. We call for an immediate political action from governments, the United Nations and other actors to prevent the normalization of solar geoengineering as a climate policy option. Come to think of it, how is dimming the sun even a solution? The only way to tackle global warming is by addressing the root cause of the problem, not covering the problem with another layer of reflective particles. Dimming the sun's rays is a quick fix. And we should be done with tampering the earth. We've cut forests, put enormous pressure on the planet by expanding agricultural land, by increasing livestock farming, by filling lakes, building houses and factories on them. We've cut mangroves, built artificial islands, polluted rivers, polluted the land, the air. We've burnt fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas. And now all of this is coming back to bite us, and we want to change the composition of the atmosphere. You see, the earth is not a guinea pig. It's not a lab rat that we can keep experimenting on. And honestly, there is no need to dim the sun's light. Just think about what happened a few months back. You know, during the lockdown, we realized that our planet has the magical ability to heal itself. 1 month of lockdown and the air was cleaner. Water was flowing once again in clogged rivers. The birds were back. The animals were back. There were less pollutants. If one lockdown could transform our surroundings, imagine what a lifetime of conscious choices can do. I know we have big goals and very less time, and we cannot let our planet's temperature increase any further. And this is exactly where we can turn to science for real solutions. We must use science to make the transition to greener fuel smoother and to decrease pressure on agricultural land. We must use science to find alternatives to livestock farming. Tampering with the atmosphere all over again is not an option. Dimming the sun's rays sounds like a Frankenstein solution. It should be off the table, as scientists say it should be. And we've got one more bizarre story for you. It's from Italy. The Supreme Court has added a new human rights violation: noisy toilets. I wish this was a joke. Unfortunately, it isn't. Italy spent 19 years debating this question: are noisy toilets a human rights violation or not? It all started with a couple living in northwestern Italy. They had a problem with their neighbor's toilet. It was too loud. Before moving on, here's Plumbing 101. Every toilet has a water tank. In this case, the water tank was embedded into the wall. And guess what was on the other side of the wall? The couple's bedroom. So every flush echoed through the other side. It was becoming hard for the couple to sleep. Was this a nuisance? I'm sure it was. No one wants to hear their neighbor's toilet while sleeping. But a nuisance is not a human rights violation. Unless you ask the courts in Italy, they sided with this couple. They said noisy toilets are indeed a human rights violation. What was their logic? Apparently, the sound of flushing plus the frequent night use compromised the couple's quality of life. It violated their right to the free exercise of daily habits. The penalty, more than $10,000 in fine. But the neighbor did not give up. They moved Italy's Supreme Court. Still no luck. The top court in Italy also sided with that couple. It said noisy toilets violated the constitutional right to health. I wish the judge had elaborated. How does faulty plumbing violate the Constitution of Italy? It may sound funny, but think about the precedent being set here. 19 years of court cases. We are talking about legal fees, valuable courtroom time, all of it devoted to answering this pointless question: are noisy toilets a human rights violation? We could have saved them all the trouble. The answer is no. A noisy toilet is funny at best and a nuisance at worst. It is not a human rights violation. By calling it one, Italy is making a joke of real violations. What do I mean by real violations? The human rights guaranteed by the United Nations, they include the right against slavery, the right against torture, the right to seek asylum, the right against forced starvation. These are human rights guaranteed by the United Nations. How does a noisy toilet feature on this list? It doesn't. I understand that quality of life is important. Every country is trying to improve its standard of living. But that is not the same as human rights. It's a dangerous and insensitive equivalence. I mean, think about it. You have children dying from airstrikes in Yemen. You have millions of Uyghurs persecuted in China. You have hundreds of journalists in foreign jails. And yet this is what enrages you: a water tank that can be shifted in 2 hours. Frankly, we don't know how to describe this case. Is it a first world problem? Is it a complete disconnect from reality, or is it both? I would say it's both. Human rights were not designed with regions in mind. They have nothing to do with your economy. It doesn't matter if you live in the first world or the third world. Every human is born with these rights, and what Italy has done here is an affront to those rights. Those rights, these numbers would tell you why. Around 2 billion people in the world do not have access to a toilet. 2 billion. Around 1.6 billion people do not have a house. This is the reality of the world we live in. When 2 billion people do not have a toilet, a noisy one cannot be a human rights violation. This is not complicated jurisprudence. This is common sense. But countries like Italy do not seem to care. They play fast and loose with global regulations. One day they say toilets are a human right. The world agrees. Next day, they say the toilets must also be quiet. This time, the world does not have to agree. And don't get me wrong, Italy is free to create their own laws. Noisy toilets, low ceilings, pineapple on pizza, whatever they want. They can criminalize anything they want. But don't call it a human rights violation, because if you do, you're trivializing much bigger crimes, the genocides, the illegal detentions, the extrajudicial murders, all of it. The West must look beyond its little cocoon, its little bubble of luxury. Inside this bubble, everything is perfect. Just look at their Wuhan virus vaccination. In Africa, some citizens have 0 shots. The West is thinking about its 4th. This is another example of their delusional thinking. And I know that was a lot to unpack over a noisy toilet, but this was not about that Italian couple or their neighbor's toilet. This was about principles and fairness. Human rights are not a joke. If you cannot contribute to upholding them, at least do not trivialize them. We'll wrap the show, leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks for watching.
Different ropes and threads. That'll be fine. Yeah, I did.